Well, a short time ago, you heard Majority Leader Harry Reid come to the floor to lay out a timeline for the agenda items today. The CR, the continuing resolution to keep the government operating into September, and the FY 2014 budget. Senators came to the floor to oppose that timeline that was laid out by Majority Leader Reid, and the Majority Leader then reiterated the possibility of weekend sessions to get this work done. So Majority Leader Reid vowing to have a budget in place by the beginning of the Senate's Easter recess. This news, the sponsor of a proposed assault weapons ban says Majority Leader Reid has told her that the ban will not be a part of the initial gun control measure that the Senate will debate next month. California Democratic Senator Dianne Feinstein says that instead of being included in the measure, the ban will be offered as an amendment. While this quorum call is underway, we'll go back to earlier today to today's White House briefing. Here's spokesman Jay Carney.
I have to thank Cody Keenan, my fellow Irish American, for loaning me his tie, because I was a little thrown off. I had corned beef and cabbage on Sunday, and I forgot that today is the day that we are officially celebrating St. Patrick's Day here in Washington. As you know, the President has a bilateral meeting with the Taoiseach, Enda Kenny of Ireland, a meeting with the Northern Ireland delegation. He is attending also the Friends of Ireland luncheon on Capitol Hill. And there is a St. Patrick's Day reception in the East Room later today. I also want to note that because of those remarks, we need to have a hard stop at 12 noon today. With that, I'll go to the Associated Press.
Thanks, Jay. There are reports out of Damascus by state-run media that rebels had mounted a chemical attack that killed 25 people. The Russian Foreign Ministry is backing up those claims, saying that they're also dead. Wondering if what the administration has on that report.
Jim, as you know, we have been very clear about our concern that as the Assad regime is increasingly beleaguered and finds its escalation of violence through conventional means inadequate, including the barbaric use of Scud missiles against population centers, that it will consider the use of chemical weapons against the Syrian people. This is a serious concern. I am not going to discuss intelligence, but it is important that as fighting in Syria intensifies and the regime becomes more desperate, that the United States and the international community make absolutely clear to Assad that the use of chemical weapons would be totally unacceptable. The President was clear when he said that if Assad and those under his command make the mistake of using chemical weapons or fail to meet their obligations to secure them, then there will be consequences and they will be held accountable.
Senator from Vermont.
Mr. President, I ask consent to call the quorum be dispensed with.
Objection.
Mr. President, what is the parliamentary situation?
The Senate is considering H.R. 933.
Thank you.
Post-closure, sir. Post-closure.
Mr. President, couldn't help but think watching the debate, it's been more than 2 weeks since we had an all too familiar stalemate in Congress that had prevented the passage of common sense legislation. As a result, it triggered the board, across-the-board budget cuts that are better known as sequestration. These automatic budget cuts, when they first went into, became a possibility, everybody said, no, Congress will be irresponsible enough to just allow them to go into place. Well, in the weeks leading up to sequestration, we heard almost daily from federal agencies, defense contractors, members from both sides of the aisle about how harmful these cuts would be. Notwithstanding the talk about how ridiculous it would go to go for it, the deadline for intervention has come and gone. Now, much of the focus appears not to be upon the wide swath of harm that's beginning to descend on communities across the nation, but instead on the closure of White House tours and whether we're going to have the Easter egg roll. Come on. Mr. President, I would hope the American public, I hope the press, everybody else would focus and how serious these cuts are. In fact, I think to simply accept and avoid fixing these indiscriminate, harmful cuts is irresponsible. They're slowly being implemented. They've already begun to affect our states and communities. I was up in Vermont this weekend for 3 days. I was all over the state. And everywhere I went, just as I do every day, I hear from Vermonters about the consequences for their jobs, for their children, for their communities. I've heard from Vermont families that begin to plan for the furloughs. They're going to hit their family budgets. Through no fault of theirs. These are hard-working, honest Vermonters, but because Congress has failed to act. I've heard from community organizations about the difficult decisions they'll have to make in the weeks ahead. It should alarm everyone that reductions are expected, for example, the number of children being served by Head Start. I've heard from young scientists at the University of Vermont who've already been denied research grants because of sequestration. And Vermonters facing high rents are facing a 7-year wait for Section 8 housing assistance. Until the sequester is resolved, housing authorities in Vermont will not be granting any new rental vouchers. And hundreds of Vermonters are going to lose this vital lifeline. Put in reality, my home in Vermont overnight we had 8 or 9 inches of snow. The next 24 hours we have another 8 or 9 inches. I mean, once it got past 15 inches, we actually had schools that closed. This is very unusual. But think of the people who do not have housing, what that's doing to them. It's an unfortunate, needless reality. I've heard about the impact sequestration is having on our military families in Vermont as some members of the National Guard prepare for furloughs. These are Guard members who called up and willing to serve in Iraq and Afghanistan, putting their lives on the line for America. But now they prepare for furloughs and reductions in staff that provide services to their families. And then we have the elimination of the Army Tuition Assistance Program serving veterans, a promise we made to our men and women in uniform when they're willing to stand up and go into combat for America. Now, these are the impacts felt in the little state of Vermont so far. We haven't yet seen the coming consequence for Vermont schools and how sequestration will affect students and teachers. We haven't yet felt the true impact of funding for the grants to support our law enforcement people, our job search assistants, the Wheels on Meals programs, or those programs that provide life-saving vaccines. Members have filed amendments to the spending bill we're currently debating to attempt to insulate and protect programs that impact their states most, but they want to do it at the cost of other states. We need to stop looking at how we can just save just a single program. Get back to the table. Negotiate a sensible, balanced approach that addresses deficit reduction in a responsible way and on the backs of the most vulnerable Americans. We cannot simply cut our way out of this deficit. We created a situation partly by putting 2 wars on the nation's credit card. This morning, it was estimated the war in Iraq is going to cost $2 trillion. It's the first war in our nation's history where we went to war and said we don't have to pay for it, we'll just borrow the money. Vietnam, Korea, very unpopular wars. We still pass the taxes to pay for it. Iraq, although it's going to be over in a matter of weeks, we don't have to pay for a year, 10 years later. Thousands of Americans killed and wounded, say nothing about our allies, and tens of thousands, hundreds of thousands of Iraqis. And we're stuck with a $2 trillion bill and growing, all on borrowed money. The only people that paid a price in that war for America are the brave men and women who served there and their families. They paid a huge price. We don't have a draft So most families didn't get touched by it. Certainly a lot of people who made a lot of money on that war, they didn't pay a price. And the people, including people who were in the administration at the time who lied to the Congress about what was there, weapons of mass destruction, connection with 9/11, things they knew were untrue. And they simply lied about it. And we ended up having that war. There's $2 trillion. Don't tell me now the same people who voted for that war don't stand here and tell me how we got to take the money out of medical research in America to pay for it, how we have to take the money out of educating our children to pay for it, how we have to take the money out of seniors who need help to pay for it, how we have to take the money out of repairing our bridges and roads in America to pay for it. My answer to them is, you voted for that. You should have been willing to pay for it. We've already reduced the debt by $2.5 trillion. The vast majority of those savings coming from spending cuts. The American people want and expect us to take a balanced approach. They know it isn't wise to protect endless corporate loopholes and tax breaks for the wealthiest Americans instead of investing in our schools and our factories, our roads, our workers. You know, I think of the billions of dollars we spend on roads and bridges, for example, in Iraq and Afghanistan. There's one Vermonter who said, yes, spend billions to build roads and bridges in Iraq and Afghanistan, and then they blow them up. Build them here in the United States, in Vermont, or West Virginia, or Oklahoma. We Americans will take good care of them. There's a simple bottom line. Putting our fiscal house in order, which we should do, has to go hand in hand with targeted, common sense steps to promote economic growth, to create jobs, to strengthen the middle class, all things that President Obama, Democrats in both houses of Congress are eager to do. But we need some cooperation from the other side of the aisle. We need cooperation. Putting on mindless autopilot the crucial decisions about what should be our budget and growth priorities, that's a terrible and dishonest way to treat the American people. It's a recipe for economic dysfunction. It threatens tangible harm to millions of families, for communities across the nation. Difficult decisions are in front of us. Every single member of the Senate should go back and read their campaign promise. Oh, of course I'll face up to difficult questions. Really? We're stalled here. People want to filibuster rather than face difficult questions. Well, we have to face them. We can't punt them. We in Congress need to put aside talking points, turn to the task of replacing these harmful autopilot cuts with sensible and balanced budget decisions. Instead of slogans, let's have some substance. The American people expect more from Congress. They certainly deserve a lot more from Congress. Mr. President, I'd ask my full statement be made part of the record.
Without objection.
Mr. President, I suggest the absence of quorum.
Clerk will call the roll.
Mr. Alexander.
Work on the CR, a bill to keep the federal government operating through September, is on the Senate's agenda for today. And Alan Oda of CQ Roll Call has this article relating to this story. Senate Republicans pushing hard for votes on amendments to stopgap spending legislation now on the floor, a move that could push back work on the fiscal 2014 budget resolution until after the upcoming recess. If the floor debate does not shorten, I would suggest we could come back the week of April 8th and complete our work on the budget resolution, said Jeff Sessions of Alabama, who of course is the ranking Republican on the Senate budget panel. In the House right now, debate on the fiscal 2014 GOP budget measure and 5 alternatives. House also actually right now working on a resolution that would provide committee funding for the 113th Congress. You can see live coverage of the House, of course, on our companion network, C-SPAN. While this quorum call is underway, work is continuing behind the scenes on funding to keep the government operating past the March 27th deadline and the 2014 budget resolution. As that's all going on, the Washington Post today has this article. Now it looks as if we're going to get not one but two new GOP filibusters of executive branch nominees. Multiple Republicans are planning to filibuster against the new Secretary of Labor pick, Thomas Perez, who was announced yesterday in the White House, and Chuck Grassley just joined in this effort today. In the meantime, it has emerged, that Roy Blunt is putting a hold on Gina McCarthy, President Obama's choice to head the Environmental Protection Agency. You can read more about that in the plumb line in today's Washington Post. While this quorum call is underway, we'll go back to earlier today to today's White House briefing with spokesman Jay Carney.
To everyone, I have to thank Cody Keenan, my fellow Irish American, for loaning me his tie, because I was a little thrown off. I had corned beef and cabbage on Sunday, and I forgot that today is the day that we are officially celebrating St. Patrick's Day here in Washington. As you know, the President has a bilateral meeting with the Taoiseach, Enda Kenny of Ireland, a meeting with the Northern Ireland delegation. He is attending also the Friends of Ireland luncheon on Capitol Hill, and there is a St. Patrick's Day reception in the East Room later today. I also want to note that because of those remarks, we need to have a hard stop at 12 noon today. With that, I'll go to the Associated Press.
Thanks, Jay. There are reports out of Damascus by state-run media that rebels have mounted a chemical attack that killed 25 people. The Russian Foreign Ministry is backing up those claims, saying that they're also dead. Wondering if what the administration has on that report.
Jim, as you know, we have been very clear about our concern that as the Assad regime is increasingly beleaguered and finds its escalation of violence through conventional means inadequate, including the barbaric use of Scud missiles against population centers, that it will consider the use of chemical weapons against the Syrian people. This is a serious concern. I am not going to discuss intelligence, but it is important that as fighting in Syria intensifies and the regime becomes more desperate, that the United States and the international community make absolutely clear to Assad that the use of chemical weapons would be totally unacceptable. The President was clear when he said that if Assad and those under his command make the mistake of using chemical weapons or fail to meet their obligations to secure them, then there will be consequences and they will be held accountable. The international community is united on this issue, and the message to the Assad regime has been very clear.
Does that mean that you have confirmation that there was indeed a chemical attack, no matter who it came from?
We are looking carefully at the information as it comes in. I'm not going to discuss intelligence processes. All I can tell you is that this is an issue that has been made very clear by the President to be of great concern to us.
There were some initial reports that this may have been propaganda. You're not saying that that is propaganda on the part of the
Again, I can tell you that we're looking carefully at allegations of CW use, chemical weapons use. We're evaluating them, but I have no further assessment to provide to you from here.
On that point, it does raise the question, however, about how secure chemical weapons stockpiles are. Secretary Kerry warned recently about the ability of extremists getting access to those weapons. I was wondering if the administration, if the President is starting to think that arming rebels like the French and the British are doing, arming friendly rebels, whether that would help our ability to make sure that those stockpiles remain secure.
Well, I would separate those two issues. First, to say that the issue of the possibility of chemical weapons use remains a great concern. You heard the President from this podium express his position when he said, quote, "The use of chemical weapons is and would be totally unacceptable." And his warning to the Syrian regime that, quote, "There will be consequences and you will be held accountable if the regime were to use chemical weapons." That's the first point. The second point is we are constantly assessing our programs of assistance to the Syrian people and to the Syrian opposition. And we evaluate them and the options available based on what we think will best serve our policy and that is to help bring about a future where Syria is rid of Assad and that Syrians have the opportunity to build a country that is more democratic, more prosperous, and a stable country within the region. And that process continues. Our position is and remains that we will not, or we are not supplying lethal assistance to the opposition, but we are, of course, as you would expect, constantly evaluating and assessing our various assistance programs. Yep.
If it's opposition or rebel groups that have used chemical weapons, as Russia has said, alleged,
I appreciate it.
How will, how you've just said that the United States wants to hold Assad accountable for this.
Yeah, I appreciate it, and I should have made clear in my answer to Jim that on that specific allegation we have no evidence to substantiate the charge that the opposition has used chemical weapons. We are deeply skeptical of a regime that has lost all credibility, and we would also warn the regime against making these kinds of charges as any kind of pretext or cover for its use of chemical weapons.
So just so I'm clear, you don't think the United States does not think it's...
Yeah, we are evaluating the charges that are being made and the allegations, consulting closely with our partners in the region and in the international community, but we have no evidence to substantiate that charge that the opposition has used chemical weapons.
And this is coming as the President is heading to the Middle East. How much of his time during talks with leaders there do you expect will be devoted to this threat specifically?
Well, there's no question that the President will discuss with the leaders of the region on this trip Syria. It is a high priority for the region and for the United States and our allies around the world. So that was always going to be, I think, a significant topic of conversation. I have no doubt that Prime Minister Netanyahu and the President will discuss it. President Shimon Peres and the President will discuss it as well, and it will be a topic, I'm sure, in discussions with other leaders, King of Jordan, as well as the Palestinian leader, at least probably. So it's hard to assess, in light of these reports and allegations at this point, how that will affect the breakdown of conversations in coming days, but it was already going to be a topic. Yes?
Staying on Syria quickly, you talked about consequences if the Assad government is found to be using chemical weapons. What kind of consequences do you mean? Sanctions or some other kind of escalation?
Well, I wouldn't care to speculate about what consequences would take place if it were to be found that the regime had used chemical weapons. I would simply point you to what the President said from this podium about this issue, language that I just quoted. This is a very serious matter. And with regards to today's reports, I want to stress that we are evaluating them and consulting with our allies about them. But on the general principle, the President made very clear that the use of chemical weapons, and I quote, is and would be entirely, or totally rather, unacceptable. And he warned the Syrian regime in particular that, quote, there will be consequences and you will be held accountable, unquote.
Separate topic. When can we expect to see the President's March Madness bracket?
Well, I appreciate the question. The President, as you know, has traditionally filled one out, and I don't expect this year will be any different. But as would be the case if, say, CNN were having an interview with the President, I wouldn't preview it for your colleagues here. So I won't do that for any other news organization.
And one last thing on the Easter egg roll. You said earlier this month that the plan is for that event to go forward as planned. But we know that the ticket confirmations have a disclaimer that it could be canceled. Where do things stand now? Which is it going to be? What do you expect?
Well, I appreciate the question, and I've noted just substantial interest. It must be the very top news story among the Washington press corps today, just based on the incoming inquiries. And I just want to be clear that we are currently planning to proceed with the Easter egg roll. Because we distributed tickets to the Easter egg roll far in advance of the actual event, we alerted all ticket holders that this event is subject to cancellation due to funding uncertainty, including the possibility of a government shutdown. Again, the language that got attention on the Hill and was reported duly by the press was prepared well in advance, and it had to do with the potential for, at least the possibility of, a government shutdown should there not be a resolution on the continuing resolution. It was not about sequester, principally. So, having said that, I want to be clear that because it certainly looks like there is progress being made, and nobody expects a government shutdown, that we have every expectation that the Easter egg roll will proceed as planned. I hope that settles the matter.
And the last one, brackets, you won't tell us if we should expect it before the president leaves tonight, or
again, I don't think it's. It certainly won't be 2 months from now, but if he does it at all. But I don't want to, scoop another news outlet. Yes.
Was the president briefed on the Marine accident?
Yes, he was.
What can we learn from that?
Well, the president's and thoughts and prayers go to the families of those who were lost and to those who are injured. We're obviously in the early stages of assessing the incident. It's a tragedy, clearly, and the president was briefed immediately on, and made aware of it immediately and briefed on it, and we're monitoring the situation.
Jay, on Syria?
Do you have any others? Yeah.
2 questions, if I may, on Syria. Your answers to the opening round of questions came in somewhat piecemeal fashion, and so I want to make sure I'm clear on this. You have told us that...
is that a theater criticism, or is it a...
It is a matter of craft, yes. You have told us that you have no evidence to believe that it was any elements among the rebels that used chemical weapons,
right,
but that you are still looking into the allegations.
Correct.
What is it that prohibits you from telling us that you have no evidence that it was the government that used these weapons?
Because we're still looking into the reports of the use of chemical weapons.
If that's so, how can you eliminate so quickly the idea that it wasn't the rebels?
I'm saying that at this time we have no evidence to substantiate that charge, and that we are skeptical deeply of a regime that might make that charge, given that the regime has lost all credibility in the eyes of the Syrian people and the world. Having said that, we are obviously assessing the reports, and without getting into intelligence matters and methods, I can tell you that we're making evaluations about the reports.
It would not, it seems to me, betray any intelligence methods or sources for you to tell us whether, in fact, you even know whether chemical weapons were used.
Again, I appreciate the question, and I can tell you that we are assessing the reports about the possible use of chemical weapons, as well as the reports about the origins of the possible use of chemical weapons in Syria. And I have no further assessment to provide to you at this time about our judgments on that. I can tell you that we're evaluating them. And I can tell you, obviously, about our disposition towards the potential for the use of chemical weapons. But at this time, we're simply, as a matter of intelligence, I can't give you more information about the assessments we're making.
And you said repeatedly at the podium today that the President has been clear on this point, that the use of such weapons would constitute a red line for the United States. But I wonder how clear the administration's position on this has been. You quoted from the President's remarks to the National War College in December, in which he said that the use of chemical weapons is and would be totally unacceptable. But about 3 months prior to that, from this very podium on August 20, the President said, and I'm quoting now, "A red line for us is we start seeing a whole bunch of chemical weapons moving around or being utilized." So what is the red line for the President?
Well, as
is
we
it moving
explained
around?
many times, and I know you're not here often, the President was talking about that, moving around in terms of the proliferation, which is a very serious issue, the proliferation by the regime to, potential proliferation to the regime to other actors in the region, potentially, of chemical weapons. So it's a fair question, but that was the distinction he was making. The utilization by the regime, potentially, of chemical weapons, we made very clear in our warnings how we would view that. We also consider a red line the proliferation of chemical weapons to other actors by the regime.
Does either of those things appear to have happened today?
Again, I have the reports today are about the possible use of chemical weapons. We are making assessments about those reports. I don't have any more information to provide you on those efforts. and I can't get into intelligence matters from here. But we are obviously treating this as a serious issue and evaluating it accordingly. Yes, Kristen.
Jay, as you evaluated, is the President also considering changing his policy towards Syria at this point? Are those discussions underway?
As is always the case, we are evaluating our assistance programs to both the Syrian people and the Syrian opposition. We have stepped up our assistance programs in both cases. Substantial amounts of humanitarian assistance has been provided by the United States and will continue to be provided by the United States to the Syrian people. Substantial assistance has been and will continue to be provided to the Syrian opposition. That assistance remains non-lethal with regards to the opposition, but we are evaluating our policies and programs of assistance regularly to assess their effectiveness and to make judgments about what would best help bring about the policy objectives that we have and that we share with the Syrian people as well as our international partners. And that evaluation has been ongoing prior to the reports today, and I think I've answered questions about this similarly in the past when you and your colleagues have asked about whether we're considering changing our approach on lethal versus non-lethal assistance, for example. And I've made the point that our position is that we are providing only non-lethal assistance, but we are obviously constantly evaluating that aspect of our assistance as well as others.
And going back to the CR for a moment, it sounds like you're confident that there will not be a government shutdown. Are you 100% confident that that won't happen?
Well, the process continues in Congress towards funding the government and avoiding another unnecessary self-inflicted wound on the economy. We take heart in the indications that we've had from both sides of the aisle and from the leaders in the Republican Party that it is their intent to move forward with passage of a CR. The President has made clear that he believes that we need to avoid another manufactured crisis and that we should move forward with continuing resolution that continues to fund the government and does not allow for a government shutdown. So the East Your Egg role is entirely likely to continue and proceed.
It doesn't appear as though the CR discussion